Item: SCP-933. Object Class: Euclid. Special Containment Procedures: SCP-933-02 and all affected subjects must be stored in a modified standard artifact containment unit that contains no electronic components. All personnel guarding SCP-933-02 and affected subjects must be equipped with standard assault rifles, a high-caliber sidearm, Class 3 magnesium flares with an active duration of no less than 20 minutes, and protective goggles. In the event of SCP-933-02 or any affected subjects escaping, all personnel are to activate their flares first and don the protective goggles second. Maximum force is authorized to restore containment. SCP-933-01 is to be guarded in a manner identically to SCP-933-02 and the affected subjects. SCP-933-02 and the affected subjects have shown that they will always make their way directly to SCP-933-01. How they determine this path is unknown. Description: SCP-933-01 appears to be an innocuous roll of duct tape. Attempts to unroll it by non-affected personnel have proved ineffective. SCP-933-02 appears to be a man in a cloak who has absolutely no facial features. All affected subjects bear the same condition, but the rest of their bodies appear as they did before their incidents. While all affected subjects have identical behavior to SCP-933-02, none of them possess its formidable strength or resilience. Affected subjects have been terminated with no more force than it would take to kill an ordinary person. During Incident 933-004, SCP-933-02 sustained 57 bullet wounds before collapsing, which had healed from over the following 238 days. While in possession of SCP-933-01, SCP-933-02 will attempt to pin anyone it can perceive, going after the closest targets first. Once SCP-933-02 has pinned a subject, it will unroll SCP-933-01 and place it over the subject's eyes, ears, nose, or mouth, with no preference. It will then remove SCP-933-01, completely removing that facial feature. Autopsies have shown that the amount of damage is considerable, with the affected feature being completely filled in with flesh and bone. SCP-933-02 will continue to do this until it is stopped or all facial features are removed, at which point the subject is to be treated the same as the other affected subjects. Subjects afflicted by SCP-933-01 will experience a strong compulsion to acquire SCP-933-01. This compulsion is augmented by an unexplained mechanism allowing them to locate SCP-933-01 at long distances. For reasons unknown, SCP-933-02 has shown that it is unable to perceive living things that are within 1 meter of a 100 lumen light source. This range increases with the brightness of the light source. SCP-933-02 has demonstrated that it can cause electronics to fail merely by being around them. This ranges from electronic lights losing power to electronic locks failing in the unlocked position. The extent of this ability is not known. SCP-933-02 has never directly harmed any personnel, preferring to destroy their weapons and then make use of SCP-933-01.